Today, we've got a super fundamental episode, Basics of Politics. We'll cover all the key questions you need to understand in order to navigate the topic. By the end, everyone will get that much sought-after foundation that makes the differences between the left and the right completely clear, brings an understanding of what people are arguing about, and clarifies where you personally stand and who you're against. Subscribe everywhere, and let's begin. Why take an interest in politics, and why try to understand it? The question is not trivial, since a very common view, shared by at least half of humanity, runs roughly as follows. I don't care about politics, and I have at least 3 reasons. First, it has nothing to do with my life. Whatever those in power say and argue about does not concern me personally. Which party wins, who becomes president, none of it matters. The same goes for ministers, prime ministers, not to mention mayors, governors, and other minor officials. Second, politics does not interest me, because nothing can be changed anyway. We are small people, they are big people, and they are the ones who decide. Anyone who disagrees simply refuses to admit their objective powerlessness. Third, no matter how much you try to understand it, you never will, because all politicians lie and all media are bought. If not by one side, then by another. This attitude must be overcome. The reason is simple. Our ideas about the world determine our behavior within it. In this case, the idea is not to read, not to watch, and not to listen. In practice, this means silence. And if we are silent, it is as if we do not exist. This is true both in everyday life and in political life. If you say nothing, others assume that everything suits you since silence is taken as consent. One may recall the well-known words of Nicholas I. In Russia, everything is silent, therefore all is well. It always seems so, but is it really? In his case, it was not, and there is every reason to believe that it never is. Politics has a direct impact on your life, your personal life. The quality of the water you drink and the air you breathe, the presence or absence of hospitals and kindergartens in your area, road safety, wages and prices, the tone of a clerk at a public office, your utility bill, life expectancy, the ability to travel abroad freely, access to Wikipedia. Politics is literally everything that surrounds you and that you encounter daily. Your everyday life, your personal well-being and comfort, these are shaped by that same president, those same ministers, mayors and governors, those same parties, their debates, laws and initiatives. If you continue to believe that nothing will work out, then nothing will work out. This is certain. The same logic applies everywhere. I won't get into university. I won't find a job. I won't earn a certain income. To be realistic, perhaps it indeed will not work out, but the truth is trivial. If you do not try, you will never know. It is always worth trying, because if you do not try, there is no chance at all. If you do, at least some chance appears. In this case, it is worth taking an interest in politics, because otherwise there is no hope for positive change. Understanding politics is no more difficult than writing competently. It requires some effort and preparation, but it is accessible to anyone. 2 things are essential. First, define your political views. This makes it easier to analyze reality. Are you on the right or the left? Do you support workers or entrepreneurs, a strong state or freedom of speech? Or perhaps you reject these oppositions altogether? This must be decided personally. If it is still difficult, then this text is precisely for you. Second, it is often unnecessary to know who tells the truth. It is enough to know who is lying. In most cases, this can be determined. Finally, there is another reason to take an interest in politics. To be a human being, not an indistinct mass, not a mindless creature, but a thinking individual with opinions and demands, aware of rights and responsibilities, who seeks to live more prosperously, more freely, and more justly, and who is prepared to act for it. I do not like quotations, but one is unavoidable. Man is a political animal. It is worth remembering this. Let's start with a definition. A political ideology is a set of views about how society should be organized. Economics, politics, and ethics are the 3 main areas people argue about. Any ideology tries to answer a few key questions. How goods should be produced and distributed? What matters more, the individual or the collective? What role the state should play, what it can and can't do, and whether it's needed at all, whether censorship and a multi-party system are necessary, and so on. These questions shape what our lives look like. Usually each ideology has several different strands. This isn't a problem or a contradiction. Terms like economics, politics, and ethics cover a wide range of relations and processes. People are different. They can agree on most things and still disagree on some. That's how different strands within one ideology appear. This is normal. Where do our political preferences come from? There are four main sources: family, education, the conditions we live in, and physiology. As you can see, these are factors we barely control. What do we do with that? First, recognize that most of our ideas and values come from our environment and were not critically examined. Second, start asking questions. Questions are the main tool. A few examples. Someone may say that freedom of speech is good. If you ask why, they often can't give a clear answer. This doesn't mean freedom of speech is bad. It means the person may not fully understand their own position. If you think the very rich should give up 75% of their income, it may be because you are poor. If you earned that much yourself, would you feel the same about redistribution? If at school someone told you that strong authority and religion are good, you don't have to hold that view for life. There are other views you may not have heard. Where to start exploring political ideologies? Do this. Answer a few questions without looking ahead. Read the next part only after you answer. Think of it as a short introduction. So, 1. Do you think entrepreneurship, which always involves one person working for another and creates dependence and inequality, is a bad thing? If yes, you likely think censorship is justified in many cases and sometimes necessary. If no, you likely think people should be free to leave the country at any time without barriers. 2. Do you think a woman should have the right to an abortion? If yes, you're likely open to legalizing some drugs and are at least indifferent to religion. If no, you likely believe military spending should not be limited. 3. Can society function without the state? If not, you likely think hierarchy and subordination are unavoidable in human relations. If yes, you likely see freedom, especially personal freedom, as the highest value. In most cases, this works well. Ideas and values that seem unrelated often go together. For example, individualism and a focus on freedom and independence tend to align with support for legalization and rejection of censorship. The more questions you work through, the clearer the pattern becomes. The terms right and left in politics appeared in France in the last decade of the 18th century, during the revolution that abolished the monarchy and established a republic. More than 200 years have passed since then. Over time, these terms picked up many different meanings as the world changed and became more complex. On the one hand, they became widely used. On the other, people used them in very different historical contexts, so the meanings got mixed. Today, these terms are quite vague, so they shouldn't be taken too seriously. It's better to describe your position using specific labels like liberal, fascist, or communist, with clarifications if needed. As noted, left and right emerged during a revolution. In any revolution, some forces push for more radical change, while others resist it or at least argue for a slower pace. Before the revolution, France was an absolute monarchy. Society was strictly hierarchical, social mobility was limited, and most people had little chance to change their status. Rights and freedoms were minimal, most of the population had no political voice, power was concentrated in the hands of the king, and the clergy and nobility had privileges. In this context, radicals were those who wanted to abolish the monarchy and build a new system from scratch. They were called left, simply because they sat on the left side of the assembly. If they had sat on the right, the terms would be reversed. Traditionally, the left includes those who see the present as unjust and call for major change. More moderate groups wanted to avoid a complete break with the past and supported a constitutional monarchy. They were called right because they sat on the right side. Traditionally, the right includes those who support preserving the existing order or changing it gradually. They often stress the importance of family, religion, nation, the army, and the state. The first three major ideologies are usually considered to be liberalism, conservatism, and socialism. Liberalism began to take shape before the French Revolution, but we can focus on the late 18th century. At that time, liberal ideas such as broad rights and freedoms and the abolition of privileges were seen as bold. Liberals were considered radicals and sat on the left. Conservatism emerged in response to these ideas, so conservatives became the right. By the mid-19th century, liberalism stopped being seen as radical. It gained support in many countries, its ideas became more mainstream, and it turned into a centrist ideology. Socialism then took the place of the left. It called not only for political equality but also for economic equality. Socialists argued that workers do most of the work but have little and are oppressed by monarchs, aristocrats, and capitalists. For the latter, these ideas sounded threatening. Things escalated further in 1848 with the publication of the Communist Manifesto, where a young Karl Marx predicted an inevitable workers' revolution that would abolish private property and transfer power to the working class. Compared to this, socialism seemed less radical, and communism came to be seen as the far left. At the same time, in the 19th century, nationalism took shape as a major ideology. It treats the nation as the highest value and argues that the state should be built around it. The people are seen as the only legitimate source of political power, and unity is emphasized over class or other differences. Nationalism is generally considered a right-wing ideology. Anarchism also emerged in the 19th century. It sees freedom as the highest value and views the state as a tool of coercion that limits that freedom. Anarchists call for abolishing the state and organizing society through self-governance and mutual aid. They are usually classified as far left, though there are variations. This was the 19th century, when liberalism, conservatism, socialism, communism, nationalism, and anarchism all took shape. Then came the 20th century, and things became even more complex. The 20th century saw more change than perhaps all previous history combined. In that time, the lives of hundreds of millions of people and our views on almost everything changed dramatically. 3 key events reshaped the world: the Russian Revolution and the 2 world wars. After World War II, rapid economic growth began, life stabilized, and people found themselves in a new reality. Politics, power, the economy, ethics, and the state were still there. But after what had happened, it was clear that everything had to be rethought, and new ideas were needed. The prefix neo signals continuity. Some ideas are taken from earlier theories, while others are revised or dropped, and new elements are added to reflect the spirit of the time. The new left of the 20th century, like the left of the 19th, aimed to change the world because they saw it as unjust. In the 19th century, socialists and communists focused on workers and relied on them as the main political force. In the 20th century, the focus shifted. There are several reasons for this. First, workers no longer looked as oppressed as before. In the second half of the 20th century, their economic and political conditions were much better. Second, there was less belief that workers could be the force that would transform society. Calls to rise up against the bourgeoisie no longer had the same impact. Third, there was growing disappointment with the Soviet Union, which had been closely associated with leftist ideas. Marxism there turned from a dynamic theory into a rigid doctrine, and the Communist Party became a slow and often inhumane bureaucratic system. In 1956, Khrushchev's speech on the cult of personality deepened this disillusionment, as it exposed a system that had drifted far from its original ideals of equality and freedom. As a result, the New Left shifted focus from the working class to issues that seemed more urgent at the time: racism, feminism, homophobia, consumer society, and the political establishment. Driven by a sense of justice, the New Left argued against discrimination and exclusion. They supported equal treatment regardless of race, equal opportunities for women, the right to openly express sexual orientation, and equal access to education and careers. They also believed that existing elites suppressed the masses and did not govern in the public interest, so they favored direct democracy over representative systems. They criticized consumer society as shallow and lacking higher meaning, reducing life to consumption. The New Right built on 19th century ideas about nation, tradition, and hierarchy, but rejected liberalism and in some ways moved closer to the left. First, they opposed Americanization. After World War II, the United States became the dominant global power, and its cultural influence spread widely. The New Right argued that Europe was losing its identity and turning into a copy of America, so they called for a revival of European traditions and uniqueness. They were also concerned about cultural differences linked to immigration. They argued that mixing cultures undermines national identity. At the same time, they did not call for violence, but for separation that would allow minority groups to preserve their identity without changing that of the host country. The New Right rejected the idea of equality. They argued that people are not born equal and that hierarchy is natural and necessary. In their view, a society oriented toward elites can be more stable, with clear roles and purposes for everyone. They also criticized liberalism and capitalism, which unexpectedly brought them closer to the left. But the reasons differ. The left criticizes capitalism for inequality and exploitation, while the New Right criticizes it for global standardization and the erosion of local identities. The core of any ideology lies in its values. Liberalism offers the following. Individualism comes first. The individual matters more than any group, whether it is the family, class, nation, state, or society as a whole. Personal interests take priority. Each person is unique, so society should allow everyone to realize their potential and pursue their own version of happiness. Individual freedom follows from this. If people are unique and define happiness differently, they should be free to act as they see fit with one limit. One person's freedom ends where another's begins. Political equality is another key value. All people are born equal and should live as equals. Everyone is equal before the law, from rulers to the unemployed. Tolerance completes the set. If people are free and equal, they all have a right to be heard. This supports free speech and pluralism, meaning a diversity of views and ideas. This is classical liberalism. From these political and ethical values follows a specific view of the economy. Classical liberalism supports non-interference by the state. Subsidies, welfare, quotas, high taxes and redistribution are seen as external vmešatelstvo. The market should be free. Prices should be set by supply and demand. People produce and buy what they choose. Competition should be open, and the state's role is limited to protecting property rights. The idea is that this leads to overall prosperity, since individuals know what they want and can achieve it if not restricted. In the late 19th century, social liberalism emerged. This was a response to the rise of socialism and communism, which criticized capitalism. Some liberals accepted these criticisms in part. They supported capitalism, but argued that markets can fail and that the poorest should be protected, for example, through access to education and healthcare. This requires state intervention, which classical liberalism rejects. Those who supported a capitalist but socially responsible state became social liberals. Throughout the 20th century, classical and social liberalism competed. States tested different approaches, balancing free markets against regulation and social protection. Over time, social liberalism gained ground. The 20th century was also a period of major upheaval. The Soviet Union rejected capitalism and built a different system. Fascism emerged. The Great Depression hit the United States. Hitler came to power. 2 world wars reshaped the world. These events forced liberalism to evolve. In the second half of the 20th century, neoliberalism took shape. Neoliberalism puts strong emphasis on individuals and their economic rights. In practice, this means deregulation and lower taxes, since high taxes are seen as limiting personal choice. At the same time, social programs are reduced. Individuals are expected to take responsibility for their outcomes. Neoliberals support privatization, global free trade, competition, and the removal of subsidies. The market itself is treated as a value. People are seen as small firms and their interactions as contracts across all areas of life. If you support individualism, personal freedom, equality before the law, tolerance, and capitalism, you can describe yourself as a liberal. If needed, you can specify classical liberal to distinguish it from modern left-leaning liberalism focused on minority issues, radical feminism, and cancel culture. Criticism of liberalism focuses on 3 connected points. First, individualism. Critics argue that liberalism overemphasizes the individual. Humans are social beings, shaped by relationships and dependence on others. Strong individualism can weaken the role of family, society, and the state, and may encourage egoism at the expense of solidarity. Second, minority rights. Critics of modern liberalism say it focuses too much on protecting minorities and neglects the views and values of the majority. Third, tolerance. Liberalism values free speech and openness to all views. But what about views that reject liberalism or call for discrimination? If liberalism remains consistent, it must tolerate them as well. This creates a problem. Tolerance can allow intolerance to spread and dominate. This is known as the paradox of tolerance. We are in the late 18th and early to mid-19th century. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing, and capitalism is on the rise. In practice, this means rapid urbanization. Industry grows in cities, creating jobs. Cheap factory goods ruin artisans and peasants, who move to cities in search of work and end up in new factories that soon ruin others in the same way. As a result, cities quickly fill with large numbers of very poor people. Their conditions are harsh. No one is waiting for them, they have no legal protection, wages are low, housing is scarce, and working days often last 13 hours or more. Economic and political elites accept this as normal and prosper rapidly. At the same time, some among them, as well as many intellectuals, see this as deeply unjust. They become socialists. The first major figures in the socialist movement were Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen. They criticized the new capitalist reality, though they were not workers themselves. They stressed the importance of labor, argued that nobles and clergy live off others' work, and called for workers to unite in associations, work for themselves, and live in cooperative communities. They also argued that people are shaped by their environment, so if you provide education, housing, healthcare, and decent wages, people will improve. Socialism thus begins as a critique of capitalism, and only later as an opposition to ideologies that accept it. Early socialists did not always call for destroying capitalism, but for significant reform. Socialism proposes the following. 1. Collectivism. Social interests come before individual ones since people exist within the groups that shape them. Cooperation should replace competition. 2. Public ownership. Private ownership of the means of production is seen as the main source of injustice because it leads to exploitation, so it should be abolished or strictly limited. 3. Equality and justice, both political and economic. The state should intervene and redistribute resources from the rich to the poor. Extreme wealth and extreme poverty should not exist. 4. Human behavior depends on environment. Improve conditions and people improve. 5. Class structure. Society is divided mainly into capitalists and workers. The former exploit, the latter are exploited. Socialism sides with workers. Communism can be seen as socialism without compromise. It develops socialist ideas further. Communists emphasize class struggle, the full abolition of private property, the inevitability of a workers' revolution, and the creation of a classless society where the means of production are collectively owned, equality prevails, and people work according to ability and receive according to need. In the second half of the 19th century, social democracy emerges. Social democrats and communists share basic values, but differ in methods and degree. Social democrats are more moderate, communists more radical. Each side often sees the other as either too extreme or too compromising. On the left-right scale, social democrats are left of centre. They accept capitalism and markets but support state regulation and a mixed economy. They focus on reducing poverty, protecting workers, and ensuring equal access to education and healthcare. Communists are far left. They reject both capitalism and mixed systems and call for a complete transformation of society. Criticism focuses both on theory and practice. First, in a market system, prices reflect supply and demand and serve as information about needs and values. If the state sets prices, it cannot gather all the necessary information, so decisions become inefficient and delayed. This leads to misallocation of resources. Second, inequality is seen by critics as a natural outcome of human behavior and social dynamics. Attempts to create full equality often lead to coercion and large-scale violence. Third, in the 20th century, communist regimes came to power in multiple countries. In many cases, this led to mass repression, censorship, one-party rule, labor camps, political terror, environmental damage, and economic hardship. Anarchism is often seen as something extreme. On the one hand, it's used as a scare word. On the other, once people understand what anarchists actually propose, they often find it appealing. The idea that anarchism is about chaos and destruction is wrong. A world of total chaos would be unlivable, so that's not the goal. Anarchists oppose coercion. No one should impose their will by force. This is not just a general preference but a core principle that guides the entire worldview. The main source of coercion is the state, so anarchists argue it should not exist. This is a consistent position. The state is seen as an institution that can restrict, control and punish individuals, often ignoring their will. It collects taxes, enforces laws, drafts people into the military, and shapes beliefs through education. Instead of the state, society should be based on voluntary associations. People freely come together, agree on rules, and can leave if they no longer agree. No one is forced to stay. New associations can always be formed. Equality is understood in two ways: the absence of institutional hierarchy and equal weight of individual interests. No one's needs are inherently more important than another's. These are the basic principles. Anarchists reject any single dominant authority in politics, economics, or morality. However, anarchism is not uniform. Views differ on private property. Many anarchists want to abolish it, while others believe anarchism can coexist with capitalism. In that sense, anarchism can be either left or right-leaning. There is also disagreement on methods. Some reject violence entirely, others see it as unavoidable in the transition. The main criticism of anarchism is that it is utopian. Large-scale anarchist societies have not really existed. Historical examples are limited in scope and duration. Critics argue that hierarchy is natural and unavoidable, both in daily life and in institutions. Power centers tend to emerge on their own. It is also unclear how to move from a modern state to a system of voluntary associations, how the economy would function, or how large-scale coordination would work. Anarchism assumes a high level of social responsibility that people do not always show in practice. Small communities may work this way, but scaling it to entire countries or the world remains unresolved. And this is Humanities. Subscribe here and on Patreon. Videos come out earlier there, along with the texts. See you in the next one. Nationalism, like anarchism, is another scarecrow for the masses. Usually when people talk about nationalism, they imagine crowds of young people doing Nazi salutes, shouting familiar slogans, and making you want to get away as fast as possible. Let's see how much truth there is in this. What nationalism proposes: 1. Collectivism. A nation is a certain community of people, and this community is more important than the individuals who make it up. 2. Nationalists are convinced that the nation exists. All of humanity is divided into nations. These nations are self-sufficient and have a number of objective characteristics. They're not alike and are easy to distinguish. A Frenchman is not an Englishman is not a Pole, and so on. 3. The nation has the right to self-determination. A nation can and should form its own state, which will consist of all members of the nation. From this it follows that the nation, not religion or anything else, is the foundation of the state, and that the nation is the only source of political power. Every member of the nation has the right to participate directly in the political process. 4. The nation is the highest value. Loyalty to the nation is the primary virtue. The interests of the nation are above personal and any group interests. Strengthening the nation-state is the path to freedom and harmony. 5. National self-identification. How do you determine who is part of the nation and who is not? Language and culture, which are closely connected, and self-identification help with this. Who belongs to the Turkish nation? Any person who speaks Turkish, shares Turkish culture, or simply feels Turkish. Thus, nationalists want a nation-state with its own national interests and argue that this is important. So far, nothing alarming. Nationalism has 3 types: civic, ethnic, and extreme. Let's start with the civic type, also called Western. Civic nationalism focuses on politics. We have already established that the nation is the foundation of the state and the only source of political power. Civic nationalists say that the legitimacy of the state is determined by how well it expresses the will of the nation. This is logical. A nation can express its will only if each of its members is protected by law and equal before it, if everyone has the right to vote and to be elected, and if the state provides opportunities for broad public discussion. Here, the nation is all people who want to live together on a single territory, and who want to take part in the life of this nation. This type of nationalism coexists easily with many ideologies and generally does not lead to anything bad. The second type of nationalism is cultural ethnic, also called Eastern. Such nationalists emphasize that a nation-state has not only its own special interests, but also its own distinct culture. It is not like others, and others are not like it. It has its own destiny, its own path, its own traditions and values that have existed since ancient times, and that all members of the nation must respect and preserve, because this is the only way to preserve the nation itself. Otherwise, it becomes diluted and dissolves into others. This type of nationalist always emphasizes the importance of tradition and continuity. Our grandfathers and great-grandfathers, our rulers, heroes, musicians and writers who lived in previous centuries are truly ours. That is, they are not just people from the past, they are us, literally. We are them and they are us, because they spoke the same language, loved their homeland as we do, cared about the same things and held the same views and acted and thought in the same way. We're all carriers of one national spirit, one national history and one national culture, no matter where or when we live or what we do. Ethnic nationalism can have some unpleasant consequences, for example, arrogance or contempt toward others. From such nationalists you can often hear something like, "Here is our culture, our language, our people, our history. This is what they are, and you, well, yes, you are something, but of course you're not our equal." Another possible unpleasant consequence is isolation. This follows quite naturally from this logic. If we have our own path and our own history, if we are so unique, then others are not particularly interesting to us and not that important. We can manage without them. The third type of nationalism is extreme. It should be discussed separately. In the modern world, the words fascism and Nazism are often used simply as synonyms for the word bad. Fascist and Nazi are labels. They get attached to anyone someone dislikes. This often works. People throw these words around and no one really understands what they mean. Let's clarify. Fascism as a political ideology emerges in Italy, and the first fascist regime based on this ideology also appears in Italy, lasting from 1922 to 1945. This must be kept in mind to avoid confusion. Fascism has a very specific temporal and regional context. Initially, it is a purely Italian phenomenon, created by Italians for Italy. Later, political forces in other countries took fascist ideas as a basis, dropped some elements, added others, and created their own versions of fascism. Thus, in the narrow sense, fascism should be understood as the ideology and political regime that existed in Italy from 1922 to 1945. In the broad sense, it refers to any ideologies and regimes similar to what took place in Italy at that time. Italy at the beginning of the 20th century cannot boast major achievements. Its economy is not among the leading ones, and it is clearly not a world power. World War I takes place, and its outcome does not fully satisfy Italy, but it cannot change anything due to its limited political weight. Many people feel dissatisfied with the situation. On the one hand, this is the case. On the other, there is an attractive image of a great Italy, with a culture admired and respected by all, with a grand past that included an empire and something close to world dominance. For many Italians at the time, the picture looks like this. There is our beautiful Italy, which deserves the best, but it's clearly in decline now. Against this background, intellectuals and political forces appear who claim they know how to restore former greatness. What they propose? Anti-liberalism. Fascism is completely opposed to liberalism. Fascists propose rejecting the principle of individualism, because the nation is all of us taken together, a collective. The interests of this collective come first. Freedom of speech and personal freedom are not unconditional. Capitalism must serve national interests, not private ones. That is, the market must be regulated. Totalitarianism. The state controls all spheres of society, manages everything, and directs everyone, because this is necessary for the good of the nation. Outside the state, nothing and no one exists. Hierarchy. Everyone must know their place. All lower levels obey higher ones without question. This creates discipline and coordination. No one debates much. No one argues. All orders are carried out precisely. The nation prospers. Fascism is characterized by a belief in a strong national leader who works only for the good of the nation and effectively embodies it. He's often called the leader. Censorship and political repression of dissent are also typical. There are always elements in society that disagree with the state's position. These elements must be eliminated because they divide people. Finally, fascism is characterized by an aggressive foreign policy. Fascists typically want either to create or to restore an empire. because this meets the aspirations of the nation. We recall that the nation is the highest value. By its nature, it seeks to be strong, independent, and great. Nothing is too costly for it, so building an empire appears logical. And empires can only be large and powerful. There are no small and weak empires. All of this follows directly from the basic principles of fascism, and, from the fascists' point of view, is good, because it promotes the strengthening unity and prosperity of the nation. So if you personally consider the nation the highest value, and believe that everyone should be ready to sacrifice everything for its good, if you are skeptical of liberalism, think that those in power know better, believe that the state should be led by a strong, decisive leader, and consider building an empire to be right, then you are a fascist. Do not hesitate to admit it. Let's move on to Nazism. Nazism is a type fascism. Nazism emerged in the same period, the 1920s to 1940s, but in Germany. National Socialism shares the basic principles of fascism, that is, anti-liberalism, totalitarianism, and hierarchy. This is why it is a branch of it, but it adds some new ideas and shifts the emphasis. Nazism proposes ideas of racial superiority, racial struggle, and racial purity. There are higher and lower races. The former are masters, the latter are slaves. All of history is a struggle between higher and lower races for survival. In essence, they are different biological species, so mixing them leads to the degradation of the higher race, which is unacceptable. The Nazis declared Aryans to be the higher race. The Germanic peoples are their direct descendants. The lower race is Semitic. Its descendants are the Jews. Hence another characteristic feature of Nazism, anti-Semitism. Like the Italian fascists, the Nazis oppose communism, pacifism, and liberalism, but not only because these doctrines do not serve the good of the nation, but also because they are, in their view, Jewish in essence. Who was Karl Marx? What percentage of Jews was there in the Bolshevik Party? Trotsky is Bronstein, Kamenev is Rosenfeld, Zinoviev is Ovsey Gersh Aronovich Radomyslsky. Liberalism is the ideology of the bourgeoisie, bankers, and traders. And what nationality are they usually? Pacifism is also part of a Jewish conspiracy, because this is how Jews supposedly try to lull the Aryans' vigilance and mix with them. The Nazis place even greater emphasis on militarism and war as a constant feature of life. Again, from the logic of this ideology, this is predictable. If history is understood as a battle of races, then one must always be ready to fight. The Nazis also take the leader principle to the extreme. In 1935, the propaganda film Triumph of the Will is released. At the end, Hess says, "The party is Hitler. Hitler is Germany, just as Germany is Hitler." Thus, if you share the basic principles of fascism, believe in racial struggle, and are convinced that Jews are the source of all evils, then you are a Nazi. Do not hesitate either. Critical remarks. They are very brief. For any reasonably sane person, fascism in all its forms is evil. Nazism is absolute evil. These ideas are insane, and their implementation leads to animal hatred, monstrous victims, and complete dehumanization. Libertarianism is a relatively young ideology. It emerges in the second half of the 20th century, although its intellectual roots go back to the 19th century. We have already noted more than once that World War II had a strong impact on humanity, and after it ends, reality begins to change quickly. Everything is rethought, new ideas, approaches, and concepts appear in relation to many different things. In the second half of the 20th century, the New Left, the New Right, neoliberalism, and many other socio-political movements and intellectual trends emerge. One of them is libertarianism, which is a kind of mix of liberal and anarchist ideas. We are familiar with both, so it is already roughly clear what will be discussed. 1. Libertarianism starts with the principle of self-ownership. Each person belongs to themselves. That is, each person by nature has the right to their body, will, speech, and point of view, and has the right to control their life and own their property. From this it follows that personal freedom is absolutely fundamental and cannot be disregarded under any circumstances. 2. The second principle of libertarianism, closely connected to the first, is the non-aggression principle. All relations between people are voluntary. Good is everything a person does of their own will, or that is done with their consent, and that does not violate the freedom of others or harm them. Evil is everything that is done against a person's will or without their consent. Thus, Libertarianism proposes maximum political and economic freedom. How this works in practice. For example, military service can only be voluntary. There can be no conscription even in wartime, because conscription is coercion regardless of whether it is peacetime or not. At the same time, a person can join the army or take part in combat, but only if they decide so themselves. A woman must have the right to abortion, because only the woman owns her body. There must be no state regulation of the economy, because it distorts competition. Taxes are theft, since they are collected involuntarily. Drugs should be legalized, because this is a personal matter. Censorship is unacceptable, because it violates freedom of speech. All of this is the consistent application of the principles of self-ownership and non-aggression in real life. The next important point is the attitude toward the state. Here, libertarians are divided into two main currents: anarcho-capitalism and minarchism. Supporters of both are very close to each other, but there are disagreements that sometimes turn them almost into enemies. Anarcho-capitalists are convinced that the state and taxes are evil and should not exist at all, because the state and taxes are always about violence and inefficiency and nothing else. Minarchists generally agree that little good can be expected from the state, and that taxes are not entirely justified. But a minimal level of them is necessary, because such essential things as the army, courts, and police require funding. Libertarians may disagree on other issues as well, but the question of the state is probably the main dividing line. Critical remarks. 1. Utopianism, as with anarchism. Anarcho-capitalism is not called anarcho-capitalism by accident. People do not understand how libertarians intend to move from modern states to societies made up of free associations. Anarcho-capitalism looks like a very appealing theory that is unlikely ever to be realized. 2. Faith in the market. Libertarians are convinced that the market should not be regulated, that everything should be private and paid, and that this will provide the greatest number of benefits to the greatest number of people compared to other economic systems. Not everyone shares this faith in the market. Many believe that if everything is arranged the way libertarians propose, it will lead to extreme exploitation and many other problems. If there is no money for medical care, people will have to die. In a situation where the market is not limited by anything, money can be made from anything. This means that, for example, the profession of a hitman becomes legal. It also means that one could open a brothel offering children, for example under the age of 10. There is demand for such things in any society. A completely free market is not as harmless as it may seem. Removing all restrictions and turning everything into goods and services inevitably leads to conflicts with criminal law. Globalism is often confused with globalization. They must be distinguished. These two words are not interchangeable synonyms, so this needs to be clarified from the start. Globalization is a process of integration and unification in the economy, politics, culture, and other spheres. Globalization is an objective and natural process that occurs due to the development of civilization. New means of communication appear, we discover new regions, we trade and interact with each other, building more and more connections. Globalization starts automatically with the emergence of our species. It is absolutely inevitable, fixed. Globalism is not a natural or objective process. It is an ideology. We have discussed liberalism, socialism, fascism, Nazism, and so on. Globalism is a phenomenon of the same kind. Thus, globalization is an objective process. It simply exists, it happens, and it cannot but happen. Globalism is an ideology that one may accept or reject, support or oppose. Globalism is an ideology that claims that the interests of the world are primary, not those of the nation-state. This general and rather abstract position in practice means the following: open borders, removal of barriers to migration, measures to weaken national identity, tolerance toward all religions, customs, minorities, and viewpoints, dominance of supranational structures, financial, political, cultural, and ultimately the creation of a world government as a logical and inevitable step within this framework. From the point of view of globalism, good is everything that contributes to the erasure of all boundaries. The final goal is to create something like one large planetary family with no states, with a world government that acts in global interests. That is, ensures that everyone is fed and clothed, that there are no wars or hunger, that resources are distributed rationally and evenly, and that all regions of the Earth develop, not just some. Global problems require global solutions is the main slogan of globalism. Therefore, action must be collective and unified. A globalist is a person who shares these views. Today, globalism is a strong trend, especially in the Western world. News about positive discrimination, about we must accept even more refugees and so on, all relate to this. As concrete examples of political forces that share globalist ideas, one can name the Democratic Party in the United States with its leaders and the Labour Party in the United Kingdom with its own. Globalists are opposed by nationalists, or patriots if preferred, who take the opposite position. The priority is the nation-state and its interests. Accordingly, all political decisions must be oriented toward benefiting the given state and the people living in it. Sovereignty is an unconditional value, therefore no supranational structures and certainly no world governments. The nation-state decides for itself what to do, and any external directives are unacceptable. The nation-state has its own authorities, courts, laws, army, police, president, parliament, and so on, and everyone is subject to them. The nation is unique and has its own culture and history, and national identity is extremely important. These must be preserved and passed on to future generations. An example of a politician who shares such views is Donald Trump with his Make America Great Again. In the modern world, there are three major issues where the contradictions between globalists and nationalists are especially clear. 1. Migration. Globalists advocate open borders, mixing of cultures, and thus the blurring of local national identity. Come to us, live, work, enrich us with your ideas, habits, and traditions. Even if you end up killing, raping, robbing, and living on benefits, nothing will be said because there are no bad nations, only bad individuals. Nationalists advocate strict border control, filters, walls, barbed wire, deportations, separation of family members if required by law, and preservation of national identity. 2. Climate. Globalists argue that since climate change affects everyone equally, the entire civilization, it cannot be left to itself. Collective action is required to develop solutions and maintain control. For this, international organizations must be created whose authority all countries will follow. Nationalists respond that they are accountable only to themselves. They cannot reduce production or emissions because this would harm national interests. Competitiveness would decline, enterprises would close, jobs would be lost, people would become poorer, and resources would be needed to switch to alternative energy, and so on. 3. International trade. Globalists support minimal tariffs and duties or their complete removal. Full freedom of trade. If you have a good product, bring it and sell it. Nationalists, as always, prioritize national interests. Trade without tariffs and other restrictions is possible, but only if there is a clear benefit, preferably greater than that of the partner. If it is necessary to protect domestic producers, sovereignty, or anything else, tariffs, restrictions, and bans will be imposed as needed. Finally, several remarks and responses to possible questions. First, in modern political discourse, the traditional terms left and right are moving into the background. They have not disappeared completely, but are used much less often, because over more than 200 years their content has become blurred. They are being replaced by globalists and nationalists who are more clearly distinguishable. The recent US election, Trump versus Harris, is an ideal illustration of this trend. Examine the candidates' programs and rhetoric. Today, identification as a globalist or a nationalist seems to be becoming primary. Second, is globalism merely a utopia? And are there any signs that a unified world could be a reality rather than just declarations? There are some indications of such a possibility, and they are called the European Union, which includes 27 very different countries that, despite centuries of conflict and disagreement, managed to reach agreements and begin to live under common rules. The well-known 4 freedoms of movement: people, goods, services, and capital. Of course, the European Union is far from the entire planet, but a transition to a unified world, if it is possible at all, must begin somewhere. So what has been achieved and still exists is a meaningful step. In addition, there are a number of organizations and institutions that are in essence globalist and do function. The United Nations, the IMF, the WTO, the WHO, the World Bank, the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, UNESCO, the World Economic Forum in Davos, and others. People meet, discuss issues, and most importantly, they actually influence political processes worldwide. Third, globalism to some extent overlaps with cosmopolitanism, but these concepts are different and should be distinguished. Cosmopolitanism is a worldview, that is, more about philosophy and ethics. The emphasis is on respect for everyone, equal rights and freedoms, and the idea that there is nothing to divide because all people are human. Globalism is primarily about economics and politics, about the distribution of power and resources, governance, and unified standards in trade and political processes. Finally, the most important point. At first glance, globalism may seem like a reasonable idea, but in practice there are complications. The creation of a world government automatically means the concentration of enormous, if not extreme, power in the hands of a very small group of people. Who would make up a world government? Most likely leaders of former or existing states and representatives of the largest transnational corporations. One could also include some Nobel laureates, if they choose to participate. In any case, this results in an institution of no more than a few thousand members making decisions that determine the lives of 8, and in the future 10 or more billion people. Given human nature, this appears risky. It was stated above that the terms right and left should not be taken seriously in the modern world. Let us illustrate this with a concrete example. Take two countries, the United States and Russia. In the United States, two parties compete in Parliament, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. If we look at history, we find that the Democratic Party initially supported, for example, the institution of slavery. It would seem that this is a right-wing conservative party, seeking to preserve the existing order and traditions. Today, the Democratic Party, among other things, supports sexual and racial minorities, women's organizations, and opposes abortion bans. The Republican Party initially opposed slavery and presumably was left-wing, progressive, reformist. Today, the Republican Party advocates, for example, reducing social spending and increasing military spending. At the same time, both parties can be considered liberal, because there have been no others in America. America emerges as a liberal project, with adjustments for its time. Now take Russia and its parliament. There are parties in this parliament, but who is right-wing and who is left-wing? From what ideological positions do people speak? This is unclear, apparently even to the speakers themselves. If right and left do not work, then how should people understand each other and how should they speak? It seems that one should speak concretely. That is, not I am right-wing or I am left-wing, but I am a liberal, a nationalist, or for example an anarchist of a certain type, with specific nuances and qualifications if needed. For such specificity to be possible, one needs to take an interest in politics, ideologies, and ask questions, first of all to oneself. One of the ways to find out where you stand ideologically is political coordinates. Despite their imperfections, political coordinates do work, giving a fairly plausible picture that can serve as a reference point. Take such tests, answer honestly, and you will not get lost. Here are political coordinates. The horizontal axis represents economic freedoms, the vertical axis political freedoms. Both axes are closely connected and mutually determine each other. On the left is collectivism, rejection of the market and property. Personally, this immediately makes me uneasy. My heart rate increases, my palms sweat. I understand that nothing good awaits me on the left side. From comrades, censorship, and equality at any cost, I move to the right. Here I see the words individualism, market, and property. I like these words much more. However, a question arises. To what extent? An inner voice suggests that everything should have limits, and extremes are bad. I follow this voice, and a clearer picture begins to form. There are also two more terms, totalitarianism and anarchism. Totalitarianism is also frightening. I view the state with considerable suspicion. First, because a person who enters state structures soon becomes a bureaucrat. Second, because I understand well how inefficient and repressive the state can be. I move upward, but again, how far? Are we ready to completely abandon the state? No, we're not. The same voice suggests that without the state it would be even worse than with it. Thus, libertarianism in its minarchist version emerges. I would like to see a society and an economy where the state is as small as possible, where most things function through market mechanisms, and where there is no authority that dictates what to read, watch, write, say, or think. This is the ideal. Reality is reality, and in practice there will always be many nuances. This is me. You should think and decide for yourself. Finally, one important remark. The overwhelming majority of people will be located in the centre, or rather within a small circle in the centre. Therefore, if you somehow find yourself close to one of the edges, or even worse, at the extreme edge, your situation will be unenviable. For most people in the centrist circle, you will be seen as a radical, a terrorist, or simply a freak. You will be accused of wanting to either kill everyone or enslave them, or make them poor, or all at once. In most cases, they will be right. You, in turn, will see them as weak, unserious, and lacking principles. To some extent, you will also be right. And this is Humanities. Subscribe here and on Patreon. Videos come out earlier there, along with the texts. See you in the next one. The political regime is the way political power is exercised and distributed. It is how a society is governed. When we speak about a political regime, we're referring to the principles by which officials are appointed, how power is transferred, the level of political competition in a given state, the extent to which the masses are involved in governance, how easy or difficult it is for ordinary people to enter the political elite, to become a minister, governor, mayor, president, and so on. This topic is highly important because it concerns every individual. In particular, it touches on such, at first glance, unexpected things as dignity and self-respect. Are we trembling creatures, or do we have the right? Political regimes are about that. The point is this: for most of history, power was concentrated in the hands of a single person, or a very narrow group of people who did literally whatever they wanted, knowing there would be no consequences. This refers to czars, emperors, khans, princes, aristocrats who once ruled absolutely or almost absolutely. At some point, the situation began to change. Increasing numbers of people started to participate in the political process. We call this democratization. Before this happened, the overwhelming majority, the people, were simply a voiceless, indistinct mass that decided nothing and influenced nothing. The meaning of existence for the majority was reduced to working, paying taxes and dying in wars, without asking questions or demanding anything in return. At one time, this was considered normal. The classification of political regimes has long been debated. There is no single agreed approach, but some framework must still be proposed. I align with those scholars who divide political regimes into democratic and non-democratic. Of course, there are those who argue that this approach is biased, because democracy is implicitly treated as an ideal toward which all should strive, while those who have not become democratic are consigned to the dismissive status of non-democratic. Arguing about this seems pointless. Any political regime has a set of features that make it what it is. What makes a democracy a democracy? The immediate answer is that, in a democracy, the only legitimate source of power is the people. However, it must be admitted that these words are rather abstract. Where are these people, and do they even know they are the source of power? All of this is somewhat vague, and one wants something more concrete. That something is the institution of elections. It is precisely this that makes a democracy a democracy. What do we choose? People who will govern us: presidents, mayors, governors, political parties, municipal deputies, and so on. Elections are not a mere formality, not a meaningless ritual, but a fundamentally important mechanism that defines the entire system of relations between the elite and the masses. Power is not something sacred or divinely granted. Power is simply people whom we have chosen. They are there because we decided so. Both we and they understand this. For this to truly be the case, elections must be fair and competitive. Results must not be falsified. There must be multiple candidates. They must represent different programs and compete for voter support. Everything must be real, without backstage deals or spoiler candidates. In the modern world, democracy is often qualified as liberal. This means that the institution of elections is supplemented by the rule of law, separation of powers, inviolability of private property, freedom of speech, assembly and conscience, openness and tolerance. Liberal democracy is, if not an ideal, then the best political system we know. Under liberal democracy, power is accountable and fundamentally replaceable. People elect their representatives, and if those representatives fail to meet expectations, they lose elections and leave. The principle of separation of powers guards against despotism and usurpation, while the rule of law protects against arbitrariness by officials and security forces. Under liberal democracy, one can write, read, think, watch, and say whatever one wants without fearing for one's life, freedom, or property. One can also move in any direction, change countries, engage in business, or not work at all, without fearing criticism from the authorities or society. At the same time, liberal democracy has its drawbacks. 1. The quality of the electorate. Under liberal democracy, every person has the right to vote once they reach adulthood. One person equals one vote, regardless of gender, race, education, experience, position, wealth, or IQ. Thus, the vote of the most informed and competent person is equal, both formally and in practice, to the vote of the most backward and inadequate. The overwhelming majority does not possess strong intellectual abilities, is indifferent to almost everything, and is not inclined to delve into laws, amendments, and programs. The majority is highly suggestible and easy to manipulate, which is why those elected are often not those who can effectively govern and develop the country, but those who shout louder or appear more frequently. 2. The power of capital. Marxists would say that those who own rule, regardless of what is declared. Those who hold capital are capable of subordinating the state to themselves. Parties, ministers, and presidents will change. Everyone will have the impression that freedom prevails, because there are many candidates, they criticize each other, there are lively debates, and so on. But in reality, all of this is an illusion, because nothing fundamental changes. Holders of capital retain their status, and exploitation continues. In leftist thought, this is called the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or the dictatorship of capital. 2 caveats at the outset. First, totalitarianism is a phenomenon of the 20th century. It is incorrect to speak of totalitarian states in the 5th century BCE or the 16th century CE. Second, totalitarianism not only emerges but also dies in the 20th century. Today, only North Korea can be called totalitarian, and even that is no more than a remnant. The essence of totalitarianism was expressed most concisely and accessibly by Benito Mussolini, who created the first totalitarian state. He wrote, "Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state." In practice, this means that in a totalitarian state there can be no opposition whatsoever, neither systemic nor non-systemic. There is no freedom of speech and no competitive elections, because all these things are potentially dangerous to the state itself. If journalists write about the failures of rulers, and ordinary people freely discuss those rulers, if some politicians try to convince the public that the authorities are ineffective and wrong, how will that end? Certainly not well. Hence, there must be only one party, headed by a strong leader, often called the leader or the chief. He is strong because he is ready to use violence to suppress any dissent and any independent thought. The stronger the leader, the more ruthless he is. A defining feature of a totalitarian regime is the presence of an official ideology. This ideology explains everything: who we are, where we come from, where we are going, what we should do, who our enemies and allies are, what the meaning of our lives is, and so on. All aspects of life must be subordinated to the official ideology. One may read, watch, write, speak, and think only what is ideologically correct. But how can millions and tens of millions of people be made to live in accordance with what the state prescribes? 2 things are required: propaganda and violence. Totalitarian regimes place great emphasis on propaganda. In kindergarten, school, and university, across all channels and frequencies, only ideologically approved information is broadcast. History, current socio-political processes and events are presented in a single key, in accordance with the official ideology. There is no freedom of speech or plurality of opinions in totalitarian regimes, so it is not surprising that a person who has heard only one point of view from birth will very soon come to believe, quite sincerely, that everything is indeed as they are told. Another instrument for creating the correct person with the correct way of thinking is mass terror. Totalitarian regimes do not tolerate dissent and do not hide it. Supporting the wrong viewpoint or someone the state considers an enemy can result in the loss of property, freedom, or life. Here it becomes clear why totalitarianism belongs specifically to the 20th century. Creating an ideology and finding enforcers who will imprison and execute for non-compliance is not difficult. The issue is scale. Effectively spreading an ideology and ensuring that everyone lives as prescribed is possible only with relatively modern technologies: radio, television, railways, automatic weapons, and so on. Repressing 100 people is one thing. 100,000 is quite another. How can one avoid confusion and understand that what we are dealing with is precisely a totalitarian regime and not something else? All conditions must be met. A state can be considered totalitarian only if it has an official ideology, propaganda that spreads it around the clock, a single party with a leader, total control over information, and unapologetic violence against dissenters and anyone deemed suspicious. Incidentally, this lack of restraint is itself a characteristic feature of totalitarianism. Totalitarian regimes do not conceal their tendencies and always act openly. They do not pretend to be democratic with elections. They openly call enemies enemies and treat them accordingly. A hybrid regime is authoritarianism at a new historical stage, so first a few words about authoritarianism. Authoritarianism should above all be distinguished from totalitarianism. As noted above, totalitarianism involves an official ideology that permeates everything. People are insistently told what to think, watch, read, and how to live. Under authoritarianism, there is no official ideology. Here the state says, do whatever you want, just stay out of politics, do not challenge power, and everything will be fine. The second difference is the durability of the regime. Under totalitarianism, rulers come and go, but the ideology binds everyone together and ensures continuity. Those who were then and those who are now are all doing the same thing and moving in the same direction. Under authoritarianism, when the autocrat dies, the regime, as a rule, comes to an end. This point is fixed. As stated, a hybrid regime is authoritarianism at a new historical stage. This means that times change, mores soften, and democracies spread. Everyone wants to be one, everyone calls themselves one, but in reality, far from everyone is. How can one tell that what we are dealing with is a hybrid regime? In hybrid regimes, everything exists in a reduced form. One can approach this either from the side of democracy or from the side of totalitarianism. In both cases, the result is a kind of mixture, hence the name hybrid. From the side of democracy, in modern liberal democracies there is separation of powers, courts are independent, there is a parliament with multiple parties, people can freely create these parties, and there are regular, fair, competitive elections for top officials with different candidates. Formally, all or almost all of this is present in hybrid regimes, so someone who does not closely follow public and political affairs may get the impression that they live under a genuine democracy. But the word formally is key. In hybrid regimes, parliamentary parties, despite nominal differences, in fact act in concert. Opposition parties that are supposed to oppose the regime are themselves part of it, merely under the label of opposition. How can this be recognized? By how the opposition votes and what it says. If opposition parties never criticize, for example, the president personally by name, or if they do criticize but vote in line with the ruling party, then this is not opposition, but actors playing that role. Courts in authoritarian settings are not independent. This means that, in certain cases, an official or a member of the security apparatus high enough in the hierarchy can pressure a judge to deliver a convenient ruling, imprison, fine, or acquit, regardless of actual guilt. Another feature of hybrid regimes is the non-rotation of power. If elections are held, years pass, yet the same people and the same parties remain in key positions. Something is clearly wrong. From the side of totalitarianism, in totalitarian regimes, opposition is banned, there is mass terror, censorship, powerful propaganda, and an official ideology. In hybrid regimes, the opposition is constrained to varying degrees. Most often, independent politicians are either allowed into power in minimal numbers, a few deputies or a single governor, or not allowed at all. This gives rise to a non-systemic opposition. People who openly criticize the authorities, gather supporters, and campaign, but cannot influence anything in practice because they are not allowed to. There is no mass terror with hundreds of thousands of victims. Repression is selective and targets only those politicians, activists, and journalists who are genuinely inconvenient for the authorities. There is no official ideology drilled into people from kindergarten, but there is often an ideological surrogate, a highly questionable mix of ideas drawn from different schools, traditions, and eras. Censorship and propaganda are present, but their intensity varies. In discussing hybrid regimes, one is constantly forced to say, but. There is no official ideology, but something of the kind still appears. There are no mass repressions, but there is clear pressure on the opposition. There are elections, but they are not genuine. There is multi-party competition, but it is fictitious, and so on. At some point, our species appears on this planet, Homo sapiens. At first, this species lives in small groups, engaging in hunting and gathering. From time to time, these small groups encounter one another. Sometimes they are hostile, sometimes friendly. The key point is that this can go on indefinitely. A state cannot arise at the level of hunting and gathering because there are not enough resources for it. Imagine living in a society of 50 to 200 people. You produce nothing because you do not yet know how. To survive, you must constantly hunt and go into the forest. You find what you find, and that is all. From time to time, you encounter other communities living in exactly the same way. Under such conditions, civilization cannot be built, because the question of life and death is decided literally every day. After some time, humanity masters agriculture and animal husbandry. This is the key precondition for the emergence of the state. Once you learn to raise livestock and cultivate the land, food surpluses appear. Everyone is fed, and something remains. This allows you to settle in one place and produce even more food. You already know how to build dwellings. Now you can sow everything around you, and there is plenty of land. Because you no longer move and are fully supplied with food, you can reproduce on a much larger scale. Your planning horizon also expands. You're no longer limited to a couple of days and can look months or even a year ahead. A new life begins, more predictable, safer, and more secure in terms of subsistence. However, problems arise at the same time. From time to time, you will be raided by those who, for one reason or another, chose not to engage in agriculture and herding. You will be robbed and will be unable to do anything about it, because these outsiders live by raiding. It is their way of life. At this point, something crucial happens. Those who live by raids do not immediately but eventually realize that instead of coming, looting, and leaving, they can come, loot, stay, and continue looting. To do this, they need to subjugate a group of herders and farmers and take a portion of the product they produce. This is not difficult, because force is on their side. If they succeed in subjugating these people, and, crucially, in holding on, then the following occurs. More time passes, and new generations are born. For them, the existing system of relations, where there are those with weapons to whom we must give, will be considered normal. No one will remember that things were once different. Those with weapons will no longer be perceived as alien bandits or as obvious evil, because they will now be called the nobility. They will stop killing and raping indiscriminately, becoming their own. They will live in special houses, and their right to power will be sanctified by the gods. Special myths and laws will appear for this purpose, and they will be revered by everyone, both the upper and lower strata. Anyone who disagrees with this order will be punished harshly. For this, the nobility, the descendants of the conquerors, will have special militarized units that are well paid and maintain order. This is how the state arises. Over time, it will, of course, evolve and become more complex. New structures and dimensions will appear within it, but its nature will remain unchanged. This nature is systematic, organized, conscious violence for the purpose of economic exploitation. What is the state in practice? The state is people, but not all people, very specific ones. The state consists of officials from the three branches of power: executive, legislative, and judicial, plus the coercive apparatus, police, security services, and the military. The state is the president, a very concrete individual with a biography, speech, ideas, appearance, and style of dress. It is ministers, generals, colonels, judges, mid-level and lower-level civil servants. Imagine a police officer maintaining order at a rally, or an official to whom you submit documents for a passport. You have just imagined part of the state. This emphasis matters because when we reason in terms such as the state is a good, or speak of the homeland or the Leviathan, we tend to picture some vague, abstract entity that is hard to approach. Realizing that the state always consists of concrete people changes the perspective. Now, based on ordinary life experience, one can ask, what are people like? They differ, of course, but all have enduring flaws. Some constantly lie, some cannot tolerate criticism, some do not value other people, some are ready to do anything for power. What changes after such an ordinary person becomes part of the state? Nothing changes. All of that person's flaws remain, but now they acquire a certain degree of power, and, with it, a degree of impunity. This, in turn, means their flaws can be given freer rein, if not completely, then at least more than before, and the higher the position, the greater the temptations. Censorship is understood as a system of state control over information in the broadest sense. This includes control over the media, politics, public speech, music, literature, art, cinema, and, in our time, the internet. Censorship arises when a group of people appears in society that possesses significant power and property. These people, whose concentration of power and wealth creates an obvious gap between them and everyone else, develop a desire to preserve the existing state of affairs, that is, to ensure that their power and property remain with them indefinitely. For this, there are several instruments. One of them is censorship. This group always acts on behalf of society, the state, or even God. They typically say something like, censorship in our society is necessary to strengthen state security, to combat extremism, to counter corrupting ideas and teachings, or to protect our children. The aims of censorship are always presented as benevolent. Supporters of censorship are convinced that if a certain film is not shown, a certain book not published, or a political party not allowed to form, the state will become stronger, because there will be fewer contradictions and disputes. People will not hear harmful ideas, will not be tempted, and society will benefit. They are also convinced that oversight improves quality. Inferior material is discarded, and the best is presented to the public. The problem is that throughout all of human history, this view has not once been confirmed. Consider the first point. Censorship has existed in all countries and under all regimes. We have now reached the present. What do we see? That censorship has not preserved a single regime and has not saved anyone from moral decline. All authorities and governments that relied on censorship have disappeared. We know everything about them. All the banned books, ideas and teachings. We have seen all the films that were shelved, heard all the music once deemed improper. We are familiar with all the speeches of dissidents, opposition figures, and heretics. We know all the facts that were once concealed, and nothing happened. The world did not collapse, although in the view of censors it should have, since we were supposedly being protected from a mortal danger. Now the second point, censorship and its supposed positive effect on quality. Those who engage in censorship in most cases have no connection to what they censor. Even when they do, they are primarily concerned with the ideological aspect rather than the artistic one. In practice, a politically motivated censor in every case only makes things worse. A film may be intelligent and innovative, but if it is deemed incorrect from the standpoint of the current political climate, it will be rejected. Conversely, a novel may be openly mediocre, but if it is ideologically sound, it will be published. The same applies to speeches, news, and any form of spoken or written word. In reality, censorship harms the talented, the thoughtful, and the free, as well as the consumer, who at best receives everything in a reduced form, with scenes, ideas, and meanings missing. Those who benefit from censorship are sycophants and mediocrities, and, as noted at the outset, those in power, who authorize censorship so that no one learns the truth or says anything excessive. Strictly speaking, in the 21st century, it is impossible to discuss the problem of political censorship as an open question. There cannot be two equally valid positions or a discussion in the spirit of weighing pros and cons. Historical experience clearly shows that censorship brings only pointless suffering and reinforces injustice. It saves no one and solves no problems, merely concealing them. Censorship is always an instrument for retaining power. It exists only for that purpose. Although propaganda has existed for a long time, it began to be studied systematically only in the 20th century. Today we understand well what propaganda is, how it is produced, how to recognize it, and how to resist it. Begin with falsehood. This is probably the first thing that comes to mind when the word propaganda is mentioned. However, equating falsehood with propaganda is incorrect. A lie is when you know that an object is white, but tell everyone that it is black. In propaganda, such messages do occur, so an element of falsehood is always present, but the phenomenon is more complex. Propaganda is distorted information, omissions, manipulations, inappropriate generalizations, facts that illustrate only one point of view and present it as the only one, rumors, amplification of some stories and complete ignoring of others, planted narratives, and so on. Its goal is to shape a specific public opinion. It is an instrument for managing the masses. Those who engage in propaganda understand well what they are doing and treat it as a job. For their work, they receive money, visibility, and influence. Propagandists have one central obligation, by any means to show and prove that a very specific pre-formulated point of view is correct, that things are exactly as presented, without qualifications or nuance. They often engage in laundering the unlaunderable and explaining the inexplicable. Crimes, strange statements, mistakes made by the regime, all of which must nonetheless be presented in a positive light. In other words, everything must be reframed so that crimes become not crimes but necessary measures to save the homeland, for example. Propaganda is built on several core principles. It is emotional by nature. It cannot be cold and always appeals to feelings, featuring violence, conflict, shouting, threats, danger, panic, demonstrative bravado, and extreme narratives described in detail. It is fundamentally subjective. By definition, it cannot be objective, because it is not concerned with the actual state of affairs and exists precisely to prevent it from being known. It is oriented toward the masses, not toward intellectuals, which means it must be maximalna simple and accessible, often reduced to short, blunt phrases, caricatures, posters, or images with minimal or no text, what would now be called memes that immediately signal who is friend, who is enemy, and what is to be done. If a country is at war, additional principles come into play, such as the claim that we do not attack anyone, we only defend ourselves, or that all responsibility lies with the opponent, who allegedly said or did something wrong or failed to fulfill promises. Why does propaganda work? And why does it work so effectively? Because of human nature. All people are highly suggestible and sklonic conformismo. We are by default dependent on the opinion of the group we are in at any given moment. Family, friends, classmates, colleagues. If everyone in the group shares a certain view, resisting it is difficult. We are also highly dependent on authority figures, experts, people in expensive suits or white coats, teachers, and simply elders. The higher the perceived authority, the stronger the influence. This has been extensively studied and demonstrated in classic social psychology experiments with striking clarity. Propaganda can and should be resisted, but this is not easy. First, one must answer honestly the question, do I want to know what is actually happening? This is crucial, because most people are not interested. People seek comfort, material and psychological, and the most comfortable position is to adopt the views of one's immediate circle, or to align unconditionally with one's nation, state, or leaders. If this is the case, resistance to propaganda is not possible. One becomes its target audience. If this is not the case, the first step is to recognize that propaganda is everywhere. The struggle for minds is continuous. Everyone who speaks on socio-political topics in the media or online, everyone labeled as an expert, historian, political scientist, philosopher, or commentator, is not speaking in a vacuum. They belong to one side or another, and, consciously or not, adjust reality to fit a certain viewpoint. This should be kept in mind when consuming information. Finally, if the aim is to approach the truth while recognizing the surrounding presence of propaganda, the method is analysis, restraint, and questioning. Questions and informed skepticism are the primary tools. Information is abundant. Images, video, and audio can be fabricated. Details can be invented. Inconvenient witnesses disappear. Convenient ones appear. Establishing the truth is often difficult, but it is frequently sufficient to determine what is not true. For example, one reads that an aircraft flew over a certain territory and was later shot down. Before concluding that everything is clear, one should pause, because nothing is clear yet. One can only acknowledge that the event occurred, then examine the statements of the parties involved. If one side first offers one explanation, then another, then a third, and these versions accumulate without clarifying one another, but instead contradict each other, it is reasonable to conclude that something is being concealed. Propaganda's subjectivity is also easy to detect in the overall tone of a source. If the news is always, or almost always, entirely positive, if one side is invariably right and the opposing side invariably wrong, this is most likely propaganda. The reverse is equally true. If everything is always portrayed as disastrous, with constant claims of collapse, this too is propaganda. In the first case, one may ask why such claimed success is not reflected in measurable indicators: healthcare, education, infrastructure, income, safety, state effectiveness. In the second case, one may ask how basic systems continue to function if everything is as catastrophic as described. In both cases, inconsistencies emerge. If you're interested in history, politics, or simply follow the news, you have likely noticed how rapidly relations between states can change. Friends become enemies, enemies become friends, betrayals occur, alliances collapse. This often seems sudden and inexplicable. Yesterday there was friendship, today hostility, or vice versa. The reason lies in national interests. Keeping this in mind makes reality much clearer. The national interest is reduced to the survival, security, and sovereignty of the state. The state in turn is not an abstraction, but a set of concrete individuals. What results is an intertwining of the objective and the subjective. There is an objective need for the state to endure, but this need is interpreted and acted upon by people, with their values, judgments, and understanding of reality. Thus, the national interest is what they articulate and believe it to be. The national interest is the cornerstone of foreign policy, because it concerns the very existence of the state. Ideological, moral, religious, and other considerations are often set aside. It does not matter who we are, where we come from, what we believe, or what we say. Nor does it matter who they are. Whether we were enemies or allies moments ago or for centuries is secondary. If, in a given situation, partnership or hostility corresponds to the national interest as defined by those in power, then that determines the course of action. The essence of the national interest was succinctly expressed by Henry John Temple, 3rd Viscount Palmerston. We have no eternal allies and no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow. From theory to practice, consider the period between the world wars. During World War I, one side was the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy. The other the Entente: Russia, France, the United Kingdom. The United States initially observed. The war ended, empires collapsed, and Germany and Russia, which had just fought each other, became partners. This shift reflected national interests under new conditions. Germany faced the constraints of the Treaty of Versailles. Russia became Soviet and remained internationally isolated. Despite differences in history, language, political systems, and values, their immediate interests coincided, and this outweighed everything else. Germany's elites sought revision of the post-war settlement, but were constrained by France and Britain. Soviet Russia needed reconstruction after war and civil conflict, lacked recognition, capital, technology, and personnel. Both found themselves isolated. What united them was the question of state viability and sovereignty. Cooperation began well before 1939. A key step was the Treaty of Rapallo, by which Germany and Soviet Russia renounced mutual claims, recognized each other, and established diplomatic relations. Subsequent military and economic cooperation allowed Germany to circumvent Versailles restrictions and provided the Soviet side with technology and expertise. At the same time, Soviet actors pursued revolutionary goals in Germany, training cadres and promoting political agitation, actions that also corresponded to their understanding of national interest. In 1924, Germany accepted the Dawes Plan, received Western loans, and later joined the League of Nations. Despite tensions, cooperation with the USSR continued, including the 1926 Berlin Treaty, which expanded economic and military collaboration. Relations with France and Britain, former allies in the Entente, deteriorated after Russia's withdrawal from the war and internal transformation. Interests diverged and alliances shifted accordingly. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power, openly declaring expansion to the east and opposing communism. Soviet policy adjusted. Rapprochement with Western states, non-aggression pacts, US recognition in 1934, and entry into the League of Nations in 1935. At the same time, France and Britain pursued appeasement, allowing Germany to annex Austria and dismantle Czechoslovakia. By 1939, the Soviet leadership reassessed its position and concluded agreements with Germany, including the Non-Aggression Pact with its secret protocol. From the standpoint of national interest as then defined, this was considered a necessary step for survival. The same logic applied to Germany despite ideological incompatibility. The outbreak of World War II again transformed alignments. Former partners became enemies, new alliances formed. The anti-Hitler coalition, USSR, United States, and United Kingdom, emerged because the Axis powers posed an existential threat. After the war, the United States and the Soviet Union, recent allies, became principal adversaries in the Cold War. Germany, previously an enemy, was reintegrated into the international system. Allies became opponents. Opponents became partners. This is how national interest operates in practice. Once this category is taken into account, international politics becomes more intelligible and apparent contradictions are resolved. The pattern is stark. Decisions driven by national interest repeatedly produce conflict, hostility, and destruction. A different logic of international relations is conceivable, but in the foreseeable future it is not evident. International relations are the relations that arise when states interact with one another. In general, they can be understood by analogy with relations between individuals. Temperaments, concerns, and levels of intellect differ, but most importantly, goals differ. Historically, the first approach to the study of international relations was realism, so it is appropriate to begin with it. Realists deal with what exists, not with what ought to be. They're interested in interactions between states as they actually occur. From the realist perspective, the entire life of the state is subordinated to a single overarching goal that determines everything, self-preservation, which is synonymous with survival. Those who are stronger have better chances of survival. Therefore, international relations are a harsh Stalknovini states in a struggle for survival. The one who possesses greater power prevails and is regarded as being in the right. Power here is understood as raw, physical force, which at the level of the state is expressed in the size, technological level, and combat effectiveness of the military. There is no altruism in relations between states. All actors behave egoistically and are always concerned only with their national interests. For this reason, there is no stable logic to these relations. They are anarchic. This means that everything can change instantly. Brothers become enemies, friends become traitors. National interest is one of the central concepts of realism. Anyone who views the world through a realist lens, consciously or not, will emphasize its importance. Another key concept is the balance of power. From the realist standpoint, in order to impose at least some order on chaos and achieve a minimal level of security, there must be great powers, major political actors, or military economic blocs that negotiate rules of the game and divide spheres of influence. In such a system, those that are not great powers effectively count for nothing. Their views are disregarded, and they fall under the influence of those who are larger and stronger. This leads to persistent injustice and double standards. International law, committees, organizations, and institutions may exist and prescribe how states ought to behave, but major powers can ignore these prescriptions while compelling weaker states to comply. The realist outlook is distinctly pessimistic. Conflicts between states, which often end in war, are not seen as misunderstandings but as the essence of international relations. Peace is not a desired stable condition, but a pause before the next, inevitable war. From this perspective, the nature of international relations cannot be changed. Just as humans cannot stop breathing, states cannot stop conflicting with one another. The second major approach is liberalism. Liberalism as a political ideology suggests what to expect in international relations. Not only states, but also non-governmental organizations, transnational corporations, Civic associations and even individuals participate in international relations, since in the modern world they can represent significant power. There is indeed no supreme arbiter to which a state can appeal if it considers another to be in the wrong. But this does not imply inevitability, because humans are rational beings. As rational actors, they can reach agreements and attempt to create such an arbiter. It is possible to establish institutions that, by defending universal values, stand above states. By deliberating together within these institutions, actors can create a system of collective security based on the norms of international rather than national law. In this way, war can be abandoned as an instrument of conflict resolution, to be replaced by negotiation and the coordination of interests. There is, however, a condition. The state must voluntarily relinquish part of its sovereignty to supranational structures. Only liberal democracies are likely to do so, since they already share these principles and values. States that are not liberal democracies are to be democratized so that they can become full participants in the international community. At this point, concepts such as humanitarian intervention emerge. The liberal view of international relations is considerably more optimistic. It emphasizes pacifism and human rationality. Agreements are preferable to conflict, and trade is more beneficial than war. Cooperation enables prosperity, development, and increasing wealth. This is achieved through the growing role of supranational institutions and the gradual reduction of the role of the state. Universal values are assumed to exist and to be most fully realized in liberal democracy, toward which all states are expected to move. Liberal democracies do not wage war against one another, although conflict remains possible with regimes that violate human rights or threaten international security. And this is Humanities. If you made it to the end, congratulations, you're a political knight. Subscribe here and on Patreon. Videos come out earlier there, along with the texts. See you in the next one.